Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Sarah Krajewski, the Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the Portland Art Museum. I'm also the curator of Andy Warhol, prints from the collection of Jordan D. Schnitzer and his Family Foundation. It's been an incredible opportunity to work with this nearly complete collection of Warhol prints, about 1/3 of which is on view. So if you can just imagine what a comprehensive collection we had to work with to put together this show. It's a remarkable testament to Jordan and his collecting vision and the scope and breadth of it. So thank you, Jordan. As I began researching with Jordan's team, I quickly realized we had the chance to present a retrospective of Warhol's printmaking. The resulting exhibition is the largest ever mounted on Warhol's work. For me, this was not a mere selection process, but a deep thinking on the way Warhol thought about images and the power they hold over us. It's a remarkable testament to the enduring legacy of his art that these images still appear at once fresh and universal today. And he did this through the medium of screen printing. I will be speaking more specifically to my research coming up on October 23rd, so I hope you'll consider coming back and hearing that talk. And another upcoming lecture I'd like to draw your attention to is on November 20th. It's with art critic and author Blake Gopnik, who will preview his new biography on Andy Warhol. You really won't want to miss this talk. Gopnik's book promises to overturn some of the familiar narratives and some of our assumptions that we've made about Warhol and his work, and it promises to be a really exciting addition to the scholarship on Warhol and his place in the history of 20th century art, and his impact on 21st century too. On to today's discussion, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers, collector Jordan Schnitzer and curator Rick Axsom. It's a real treat for me to welcome Rick to the museum. We crossed paths like ships in the night about 20 years ago at the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art, where I was formerly a curator, and Rick curated an exhibition for us. Rick Axsom, senior curator, now at the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art in Madison, Wisconsin, former senior curator of prints and photographs at the Grand Rapids Art Museum, and professor emeritus of art history at the University of Michigan, has published extensively in the area of modern and contemporary prints. He's prepared catalog raisonnés for Frank Stella, Ellsworth Kelly, and Klaus Oldenburg. And for these catalogs, he also organized accompanying print retrospectives. He's also arranged retrospective exhibitions for the prints of Jasper Johns and Andy Warhol. He and co-author David Platzker, the curator of prints and drawings at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, received the 1998 Charles Whittenborn Book Award for Printed Stuff, Prints, Posters, and Ephemera by Klaus Oldenburg, a catalog raisonné. His Drawn from Nature, the Plant Lithographs of Ellsworth Kelly, earned the 2006 Book Award from the International Fine Print Dealers Association. Dr. Axsom is emeritus member of the Print Council of America and currently sits on the editorial board of Art in Print, to which he is a regular contributor. Jordan Schnitzer is a native Oregonian. He attended local grade school and high school before graduating with a BA from the University of Oregon and obtained a JD from Lewis and Clark Law School. Jordan began working at his family's real estate company at the age of 14, but started full-time at the company after finishing law school. He is now president of Harsh Investment Properties, a commercial real estate company with properties in 6 Western states and a staff of over 250 professionals. Jordan's first involvement in civic and community activities began with board memberships at the Japanese Garden Society of Oregon in 1977, the University of Oregon Art Museum in 1978, and the Portland Art Museum in 1981. Since that time, he has served on over 30 nonprofit boards and organizations. Jordan's mother, Arlene, operated the Fountain Gallery of Art, which specialized in contemporary Northwest artists for 25 years. So his first love of art was Northwest artists, many of whom we have here in the Portland Art Museum. Starting in the late 1980s, Jordan began collecting prints and multiples of the post-World War II American artists. His collection now is in excess of 10,000 prints and is made available to museums across the country for free. Jordan and his family foundation have sponsored over 100 exhibitions in over 80 museums, like this Warhol exhibition here at the Portland Art Museum. Jordan has received a number of honors and awards, including Portland State University's President's Award for Outstanding Philanthropy, State of Oregon Governor Arts Award, the University of Oregon Presidential Medal, and has received honorary degrees from several universities. He is very proud of the Art Museum at the University of Oregon, which was renamed in his honor in 2005, and recently broke ground on a Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at Washington State University. So very deep commitment to the region. Jordan lives in Portland with his family, and we're so pleased to have you here today. So I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you.
Well, before you start, it's always embarrassing. I love hearing your resumes. I always get embarrassed hearing mine. But just to add for 1 second about this gentleman, because he is very humble, but in my opinion, he is the foremost art writer, not necessarily critic, there are other critics, but art writer in the country. And when she went through all the things that he's written and done, the relationships that he has formed with all these artists is incredible. And the kind of collegial caring they each have for each other. And I've been the recipient and been blessed because of his relationship to have gotten to know Ellsworth Kelly and Frank Stella and Terry Winters and others, dragging along his coattails because he's the one that's had the established relationship for all those years. And just to show you for 1 second the magnitude of the last 10 years we've been working closely together, the 30-pound Ellsworth Kelly collection resume, we worked on for 3 years together, and Ellsworth was amazing to get to know, amazing to work with. The only time we ever had a disagreement was I said, hey, we need to have some bright images on the outside of the book so when it's in museum stores, people will see it. So Jack Shear, his partner, called him and said, Jordan, he doesn't like that idea. And I sat there thinking, wait a second, what am I doing? Questioning the foremost colorist and graphic eye in the country. But he compromised, and we put these pieces on that come off. And and we worked on that, and I mean, it is brilliantly done. I think a little too heavy. We then worked, again, this is all Rick's work, on a book called Letters to Ellsworth. I wanted to do something extra special for Ellsworth Kelly, so working again with his partner Jack Shear, and we surprised Ellsworth. He obviously knew about this and had a big hand in its production, but we went to 20 of his closest friends, people like Aggie Gunn and Dorothy Lichtenstein, Bruce Gunther. I had him do a letter, and people wrote letters to Ellsworth talking about the role that Ellsworth Kelly played in their lives. And we surprised Ellsworth the night before the LACMA opening about 10 years ago, whenever it was. And he was so touched, he kept this by his bed, and he passed away December 27th. But we did that. That was our second one. Then we did, working with Frank Stella, we did this spectacular book that came out in February with all of Frank Stella's prints in multiples. And again, to see Frank Stella and Rick just talk and interface with each other was just a treat for me. And then we most recently did the Andy Warhol book. And it's upstairs. The museum got 300. We printed 4,000. The rest are still coming from Italy. And DAP will be distributing this. And again, I do these books as labor of love. You don't cover your costs at all doing these things. But I really would encourage you. This is a brilliant book. And one thing about this that when I called Rick and said, we're going to do this amazing show here, let's do a book, but let's do something different, because there's so many books about Ellsworth Kelly. He went to work and came up with, what we'll talk about in a minute or two, a new idea that no one has ever thought about that is brilliant. So he pushed the critical writings about Andy Warhol. So I think on behalf of all of us in Portland, it's just a real honor to have you here. And we, all of us in the art world, are indebted to all that you've done to help us understand the teacher that you are, these amazing artists of the last 50 years. So thank you.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I'm speechless. I can't begin to express my gratitude to you for all that you've allowed me to do. I'm privileged to know you so much for our exchanges, and we are so joined at the hip on so many issues concerning art. But also the simple matter is that without Jordan's support, I would have nothing to show in the way of Kelly and Stella and these wonderful projects, or writing for the stunning exhibition catalog that Jordan published for the Warhol exhibition. We both hope to continue working together, and I think we will. In fact, at the IFPDA Print Fair in New York in early November, we're going to shake hands on the next project. So it's been such a pleasure in my post-academic life, which is becoming more and more exciting than anything I did in Ann Arbor for 40 years. And this is my return visit to Portland. I was here for the Kelly, and I've come to like this city so very much. It's probably fairly lame to say that in my great affection, I consider Portland Madison West. Because you know why. Kindred spirits in so many ways. So we?
Let's start, but let's do this, because we'll talk a bit about some of the work.
Yes.
And yes, we can answer how I got into collecting art and so forth. When we came over here the other day and started taping you, and you talked about when you were a student, because you know how, what I say to everyone is, you don't need to know anything about an artist. Just look at work and experience it. I've also said that somehow with visual art, we have a different expectation of ourselves than other art forms. In other words, when you hear some new music, you don't sit there and say, well, what was that writer, singer trying to get across, or what instruments are being used? When you look at nature, you don't sit there and say, gee, that sunset, what's the particles in the air and everything and how to, okay? But somehow with visual art, there seems to be an expectation that we understand it immediately and have an answer. And therefore, with abstract art, it drives so many people crazy, and I've had to answer 1,000,000 times, let yourself just experience it. Don't worry, just feel it. Just experience it. So we'll talk a little bit more about the art, but after I talk about that, I always talk about the fact that when you know a bit more about the artist, and you go back in time to understand when the artist was working, it adds another dimension. Some of you may have heard, but I've used the example that when I was at the University of Oregon, I was an English major, and I loved American novel. And we had a fabulous professor named Clark Griffith, and he'd talk about the bell jar. And we'd read Faulkner and Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Hawthorne and Twain and everybody, and I loved it. And I remember reading like Faulkner. We read Sanctuary. And I just, couldn't. You know those books when you hate to come to the end, you want it to keep going? So I finished the book and I got to class. It was in PLC 180. It was a big room. And I sat there knowing everything there is to know about that novel. And I just got it down cold. And he started talking. And he talked about relationships and layers. And I sat there looking around thinking maybe I read the wrong book, And then I began to, as he did with every novel, come under his spell, where he did what he was supposed to do. Being a professor, a student, having read all the critical things, his own ideas, he took us below the surface and began to add so much more depth to my appreciation and understanding of Faulkner. So when I give my talks about any of these shows I go to about any of the artists, we'll first talk about the art and their relevance, but then we'll begin to talk about the time and place and maybe what influenced the artist to help maybe others get a broader sense of it. The other day, Rick started talking about when he was a student. And why don't you relay, I know it may seem corny to you, but I think it's hard for us to go back in time because depending upon the age of the audience, Andy Warhol's been a superstar for most of our lives. As we know, it took a long time for him to get established. So the stories you talked about when you were in art school are wonderful because it helps set the time of his emerging and the influence he had on people like you.
Is it the bookstore story?
Yes.
Oh, dear. Well, Warhol came to town when I was a senior at the University of Michigan, 1965, and he was established. I mean, he becomes Andy Warhol in 1962. Just by 65, he was an international superstar, and he was coming to town, and there was so much excitement about him visiting this one bookstore where he would sign whatever you brought. Well, I had my cronies in school. We all loved Warhol, and this is absolutely true, and it was just a sight to behold. On the day before, and the day of his visit, students, and I'm sure adults, ransacked every grocery store in Ann Arbor. There was not one Campbell's soup can left. And so here, imagine this, standing in front of the bookstore, and the line is huge. It's being mobbed outside, and everybody has a soup can. Well, he signed. He was very gracious, and I did not know Warhol. I saw him in person this time. It's such a contrast with the public persona of the detached dandy from New York, and to see a young man who was just so vulnerable and shy as he was signing. Well, now I could say I saw this, but I didn't. But it was still a good story because it was in the Michigan Daily the next day. There was a young lady in the line who did not have a soup can, and it was her turn. Do I dare do this? Do you know what she did? And Andy Warhol, just without batting an eye, signed her bra.
And I've been trying to collect it for years.
Jordan! It was a very exciting time. I mean, I was an undergraduate and graduate student in the 60s, lucky me. And just one other here about at that time. I hung out with the artists. I was in art history. I hung out with, it was a party, a loft party, the equivalent thereof in Ann Arbor. And I went with some friends, and I said, what are all those, what's all that on the wall? I don't get it. Well, the young lady, the young artist, had filled her apartment with paintings of Oxidol detergent boxes. And I was totally stupefied. I had no idea what was going on. And this is also a sign of what happens in academia. She said, well, all the faculty is doing soap boxes, and they're doing detergents, and they're doing cans. Of course, that was the impress of pop at that point, the influence that it had. But it was all very, very exciting, all very exciting.
Tell me about the Volkswagen trip and you're buying.
Oh, okay. This is more fun, perhaps. Now I'm in graduate school in 1968, and modern was always, I was going to do nothing but modern. And of course, in 20th century art, what I didn't realize, thus far, it's 1967, it was my great, great love. And an art gallery had opened. If you know Detroit, you may know the name anyway, the Hudson's Department Store, which was like, Dayton's, it was like the big emporium in Detroit, and they had opened an art gallery with contemporary works, mostly prints, some paintings. There were the Moreaus and the Dalís, but there were also the Kellys and the Robert Indiana and Stella, and so and this is the image. It's very sweet and nostalgic. Yes, we piled into a car, and I swear this is true. It was a yellow Volkswagen Beetle convertible. Right? That's what you drove in the 60s. And I'm only kidding. And we headed out on I-94 to Detroit. There were 4 of us. We were so excited. We went upstairs into the gallery, and oh my goodness. And so, I'll take this one, I'll take this one. As I told Jordan yesterday, I didn't have any money, so I used my mother's plate. And those of you from the period know that was an early name for credit card. So I paid her back, but I left with a Kelly and a Warhol, Jackie 2, which is in the show, for $40, and the Robert Indiana Love poster, 36 inches, Well, I wish someone had taken a photograph, because here are these 4 kids from Ann Arbor, each with their prints, with legs hanging out over the car and with the poster going this way, speeding back to Ann Arbor with our trophies from the Hudson's department store art department. And that was so exciting. Prints then were available, and much of what Warhol and others felt during the American print renaissance, as it was already being called, was how democratic prints were, because kids like us in our early 20s could have an authentic expression by artists that we truly, truly admired.
Wonderful. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Should we get back on track now? What do you want to ask?
Okay, well,
Aren't those special memories?
That was fun. Well, of course, I'm going to thank you for making possible this extraordinary retrospective here at the Portland Art Museum, and for the catalog, which you saw the cover of. It really is it's produced absolutely beautifully, and Sarah's texts, which give you an overview of Warhol's career, is quite wonderful. And also, what I like very much, and this will be a tease because we'll come back to this, the cover. It's not what you might expect of a Andy Warhol exhibition catalog. Like, where's the soup can? Where's Monroe? Where's Mao? He is so good. Flip it to the back. However, just in case, a sunset on the cover. And as a contributing writer and working from afar, I mean, all the beautiful work done by the design team and Sarah in the museum for this really extraordinary exhibition, I can only stand by and admire. But as a print historian, just as a viewer, as a lover of Warhol and of contemporary art, this exhibition truly is highly original for its depth and its scope. It takes Warhol's commitment, engagement with the printed image on paper from the 1950s, from relatively little known to general audiences, most likely, the commercial work he did in New York City during the 50s. Some of you may not know that he was the toast of the town in the 50s. He was New York's most famous, celebrated graphic designer. He made so much money, which by 1960 he had spent. But nonetheless, he was at the top of his profession, graphic commercial design. His work during that period, both promotional materials and also self-published materials for friends, is in this exhibition. I've seen some of this work here and there, but never brought together in an extraordinary introduction to this first chapter. And Sarah just so thoughtfully sectioned the show into this first chapter, the 50s, and then the 60s, 62 to the early 70s, when all of the familiar images, like we're seeing here on the screen, early self-portrait from 67, actually from 70, a screen print from the Flowers portfolio, were made. But then it also includes what is like the third and final chapter, the 70s up to his death in 87. That material, for the most part, is not what is shown in your Warhol show. And I'm going to use a cliche. This exhibition is not just another Warhol show. And believe me, I would go to just another Warhol show. But this show gives that the arc, the trajectory, which takes you past the 60s and the 70s, which is less well known, and to portfolios such as Endangered Species, which I think is as great a portfolio as he ever did, and that dates to 1983. Here, let me get my little button. We'll clip right along here. Well, with that said, let's turn to you, to your collecting, to your passion for Warhol, which we both share. And let me ask you about when and how you began collecting Warhol's prints.
Well, as many of you know, so I'll apologize for those who've heard this before, but I was lucky because my mother, who's sitting right here, is the reason why our family got into the arts to the degree that we did. So when I went to Ainsworth Grade School in the first grade as an only child, she looked around for programs between 9 and noon to do something. She'd done a lot of volunteer work and golfed a lot, and she found the program at the Portland Art Museum. So she enrolled, and the story that she's told, that I'll just mention real quickly, is, she was about 30 and the students were 18, 19, 20, and she tells the story and mentioned it just yesterday again, that when she got here, and what is so amazing about this Warhol exhibition is it is in the same gallery, the same space where the Portland Art Museum Art School was before it became PNCA and moved out of the building. So in terms of this show being for our family coming home, it doesn't get any more meaningful than that. But she tells the story, and I should bring the mic down to you to tell the story, but she got to class, got to the school, and all the kids were running all around, and she felt so confused and so lost. She wasn't sure it made sense for her, and she was about to leave that first day, and suddenly a young lady came over and said, "Gee, can I help you?" And she introduced herself, and my mother introduced herself, and the young lady took her around and helped her get a locker and helped her find where the classes were, and just was, in her words, an angel. And my mother felt more comfortable and met Louis Bunce and Mike Russo, the two principal big teachers, and so forth, and that started her classes there. The next day or two, she went to go find this wonderful young lady that helped her and couldn't find her anywhere. And so it's always been this sort of mythic story of an art angel coming down to help you. So after 3 years of attending classes, and I would come in the second grade and third grade and see them in their smocks and all the easels and everything, and Mom brought all these canvases home and so forth. Louis Bunce and Mike Russo and then Carl Morris, who wasn't teaching here but was probably the most successful of the local artists, complained that while there was a wonderful rental sales gallery, as there still is, there was no contemporary art gallery. So she, along with her mother, Helen Director, my grandmother, and another lady, Edna Brigham, who then left a couple years later, moved to Reno, opened the Fountain Gallery of Art. So named because the cheapest space in town was in the Newmarket Theater building, built in 1889, the space on the corner, and it was $50 a month, and it was kitty corner from the Skidmore Fountain. Now, it's interesting, I remember going down when the artists were there and she was there and they were painting the walls and sheetrocking and a couple days before the first opening. And it's ironic, and I just thought of this a couple of years ago, that I remember coming down as a third grader and looking around while they were painting the walls and whatever, and I looked over at a corner and there was this very odd-looking sort of chest. And I went over to it and I saw it and it had all these thin little drawers, and I thought, well, those aren't big enough for shirts or sweaters. I wonder what's in there. And so I pulled open this drawer and I'm looking down at this gorgeous fuchsia-colored, almost like finger painting kind of design, and my mother comes over my shoulder and she says, "Do you like that?" And I said, "I think it's beautiful." And she says, "Well, you can have it then." And little did I know that it was done by an artist, Stanley William Hayter, who was a British artist but spent a lot of time in Paris, and a big time artist, and a work on paper. So the first thing I ever got was a print. But she ran the gallery for 25 years, and as many of you know, Laura Russo, who worked for her for a number of years, then sort of took over the gallery and did a wonderful job till her unfortunate demise. And I think now we're thrilled that Martha Lee announced last week that she's changing the name of the gallery to the Russo Lee Gallery, which continues to honor Laura Russo's legacy and therefore my mother's legacy, and yet puts Martha Lee's stamp on it, and she's done a heck of a job continuing that important gallery. So when my mother closed the gallery after 25 years, I was on the board of the Portland Art Museum, and we had a board room downstairs here before it was all remodeled, and I came upstairs, and there was an exhibition of prints and drawings curated by the late, great Gordon Gilkey. And I remember going in and seeing these amazing prints of the New York School, of these modern masters, and thinking, I want to keep my commitment to art of our region, and I always preach, as I will right now, at all 100 museums around the country I've gone to, the importance of our supporting local artists. But I thought it might be fun also to buy a few of these prints. So I went down to Bob Cox's Ogden Gallery. I don't know if he's here today, but he's been a wonderful friend and partner. And I went down and bought a small Frank Stella, Triangle One, and I bought a David Hockney from the Blue Guitar series, and a Jim Dine, a heart, a skull, and a cross. And as I was leaving, I saw a Frankenthaler and a Motherwell and whatever. And then as I tell the story more quickly, I then got a catalog from Christie's and Sotheby's and then Butterfield, which is now Bonham's. So I started buying more of these prints of the New York school of the modern artists, the major artists, and I was on the board at the Art Museum at the University of Oregon, and David Robertson, the then director, asked if he could do an exhibition. I said, sure, since most of the work was in storage. So usually if we asked for questions, someone would say, well, where were you putting these prints? And I'll say, wait a second, I had a mother that was a gallerist. I heard her say 1,000,000 times when, the Winklers never said this, but maybe Doug and Lila Goodman or someone else would come in and they'd say, gee, Arlene, I love that Mike Russo, but I don't have any wall space. And she'd say, the good gallerist and merchant that she was, look, if something speaks to you, don't pass it up because you don't have wall space. Rotate it, put it under your bed, but don't pass it up. So I'd blown through wall space before I finished college. And I had a few of the prints up, but most in storage. So I went down several months later to the museum where I'd put on so many events. It was so wonderful to walk in and see these works up in spaces that we don't have in our homes. But really what set about this program was seeing people come in. And just like yesterday and the night before at the museum here, to see people come in and smile and gawk and frown and all the things we all do when we experience art, I thought, you know, growing up in the Northwest, we didn't have the kind of exposure to contemporary art that people in the Eastern Seaboard and some of those bigger cities have. So wouldn't it be nice to marry my passion for buying the work with a program of getting it for free to university museums and regional museums? And never did I plan or know it would become such a big program where we have 4 people working full-time now. Catherine Malone is right here, the collection manager. Raise your hand because you're the hero in the background. And we have 4 or 5 shows traveling at any one time, and it's so much fun to go around the country. And we also fund outreach programs, bring school kids in, because most of the school districts are broke, and Brian and the team here have done a fabulous job. There's commitments, I think, Sarah, I heard of 20,000 students already programmed to come into this exhibition. So that's how we got started. I buy prints often every week. There was a fabulous Wayne Thiebaud auction last week, and then the last thing is we started doing some books. I did the first book on Liechtenstein with Chris Bruce from the Washington State University Museum there, and that was so much fun. We then did a catalog raised name for John Buck, Deborah Butterfield's husband, and then that ramped up with the first big catalog raised name was John Baldessari, and then I did a book about him. Then we did the Ellsworth Kelly, the book about him, then the Frank Stella, now the Warhol book. We're doing Terry Winters next, and Bruce Nauman also, and it's really fun. I just can't tell you the joy I get. No one walks in these shows and has the joy of seeing the work. I have no sense of ownership, none. I keep track of the value of the work for insurance purposes. I don't carry any financial statements. I've never sold anything. There is no sense of ownership. I don't know where I would go to if I suddenly said I own this pedestal. I don't know what that would mean. I feel a huge sense of stewardship. And since I love the work, I love seeing it. And while it sounds absurd, because all these museums are so nice to thank me, but no one's happier because I get to see the work up. And second of all, I've said before, if I was blindfolded and we listed all 10,000 prints on a wall and I threw a dart, if it landed anywhere, I'd feel the luckiest person in the world just to have one. The fact I'm able to have a lot. It only makes sense because of this public program. And therefore, the only sense of responsibility I have is getting the work out. Because if I weren't getting the work out and building this public collection, then sitting here saying I've got 10,000 prints would be sort of an avarice or something that I wouldn't, it wouldn't reflect the values that would be mine. In other words, if you can't experience things and have a little bit more than you might need to rotate it, but we've become the largest provider of exhibitions of anyone in the country. And it's not like we set out to do that to be some big hero doing it. But it's so much fun to get to all these places. And with my real estate hat on, just plop me in a car in Omaha, Wichita, Jacksonville, Tampa, Salt Lake, Missoula, and I'm happy just driving around like Jim and other people in the real estate business would be seeing all these communities. So it's been just an unbelievable blessing to have this passion and joy in my life.
And your passion has been focused so very much on primarily American artists since 1960. So I smile too because when this question is asked, I can ask you, you seem to have a particular passion for Warhol because evident in the number of prints you have, this exhibition, but then we would both smile because then if we started talking about Kelly, well, yeah, I have this greatest passion for Ellsworth. And then Frank, and I was trying to think of a song from the 40s, something about him always in love with the girl I'm with, and I never can get that title right, but it means that whoever we're talking about, he and she, they're the best, and then you go to the next one, nah, but you do. I think Warhol has been seminal to your collecting, and I was going to ask you, and here we can get into some fun stuff. In Warhol's case, what attracts you to him? Can you speak to that?
Sure. I think there are a couple key reasons. One is artists from time immemorial, and I keep saying this and saying this till I'm a broken record, are always chroniclers of our time. Whether we look back and we go to the caves in France, we look at Egyptian art, Roman art, Greek art, Impressionists, anywhere you want to go. They were always at the forefront of reflecting the social issues, the political issues, the social mores of the time. Furthermore, for people that say, abstract art, none of you have ever said that, but I've heard that a few times. They'll say, why can't they do these nice paintings of landscapes and mountains and so forth? And I'll say, well, first of all, they all could and generally did in art school. But I said, each artist has to build upon the legacy of those that came before. Now, in terms of an artist, every single one of you is an artist. At first, we all took art in school, and you probably still now doodle on a napkin at a restaurant and whatever, okay? So we're all artists. Many of you play instruments. Not many of you probably are in the Oregon Symphony. But anyone is an artist. But to move on up to be the level of an Andy Warhol and other artists in this museum, you not only have to have a passion and a theme you want to get out, but you've got to do it in a way that is different and hasn't been done. If we were showing works that looked like Van Gogh, you'd sit here and say, what are we doing sitting here? We had a Van Gogh. It's amazing. So each artist has to push the envelope and get that burning passion out in a different way. So you combine those two things. Artists are chroniclers of our time. Artists are always contemporary artists. And artists have to do something differently. So born in the 50s, what are the themes of my life and of all of your lives? Okay, everything we've lived through. Well, therefore, I respond to artists of our time. I find the historical artists interesting and fascinating, but the contemporary artists speak to me more, and they force me to deal with the issues of our time, and whether it's consciously or unconsciously, I always feel uplifted when I come away from these exhibitions. Maybe I have more clarity about the views of the political scene, the international scene, the personal issues, all the things that all of us have as human beings every day. So that's why I like contemporary art.
Well, I can't blame you at all, and you're reminding me that this is an idea that has had some currency for some time. In the mid-19th century, French writers and artists were declaring a mandate for what the artist should do, for what the modern artist should do. And in a word, and I paraphrase this mandate, it's necessary to be of your time. And I think we agree, Andy Warhol certainly was of his time and is a great chronicler. In fact, not to get too literary here, but we've talked about how Warhol is in some ways a counterpart to Walt Whitman in the 19th century. He sings America, and he sings it in many different registers and very, very different tones, but it brings the culture to you because he's bearing witness. And an artist bears witness to his time, and he very, very much does that. Jordan, our discussions about Warhol. And this is sort of how we got started, okay? The range of Warhol. I hope you're enjoying, as we move through, it's not, it's so very nuanced, all the different things he touches upon, but what got us excited earlier this year was when we discovered an admiration for what we call the political Warhol. Yeah, evident, absolutely evident in the 1964 screen print of the Birmingham race riot, or in this wonderful poster for the McGovern-Nixon election. Just demonically funny and witty. But you would think, this is back in the 70s and 60s, that curators and writers and commentators would have just grabbed onto the political Warhol. Believe it or not, in terms of exhibitions, it's only been in the past 12 years or so, 10 years plus, that institutions, and not a slew, have begun to address it very, very specifically. Warhol, he was raised in Pittsburgh. He had left-wing ideas from the very get-go. He gave to charities. He promoted, as you can see here, you obviously know what his politics might be. So if I ask you, I think you perhaps in part have answered this, what draws you to the political Warhol? Because this is when we had that conversation. I said,
Sure.
I raised my hand. Can I write for your catalog? Because I'd always wanted to write on the Flash portfolio and also the Sunset Series 2, because they are so very much to the core political in fascinating and complex ways. But
Let's do it. Let's take it away. Why don't you go to the S&H green stamps and the tomato can for a second?
Okay. We're going to have to flash forward.
Yeah.
Oh, but I have an October surprise. You can't. It's the next slide.
What is it?
Uh-oh. He doesn't know this. The spiel was that, and it's true that Warhol of his time, here we're in the 60s and 70s, but he is always topical. I mean, I think that's why the accessibility of the image, the photographic image, but also what he addresses are still issues today. Shall I show you how they are still issues today?
Is that great? Is that great? Hilarious. Hilarious.
Don't mean to offend, but all in good good humor.
That's great.
But let me get to the green stamps. We may have to trip lightly through some imagery here. The endangered species, one of the great portfolios, as I said.
We'll come back to those.
Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about Andy Warhol in particular, and let's go back in time a little bit. And I think what we'll do is I'll talk about his history a little bit, about a couple images, then turn it over back to Rick to talk about his new amazing thoughts about the Sunset series and so forth.
My goodness.
Okay. So as I mentioned, you don't need to know anything about an artist to appreciate their work. But as you begin to, like Professor Griffith did for me, go down into some layers. So Andy Warhol was born August 6, 1928 in Pittsburgh. His parents were immigrants from what now is Slovenia. They were part of the, in essence, Greek Orthodox Church. His father worked for construction companies. His father died when he was a sophomore in high school, so he doesn't talk about his father having a huge influence on his life, but his father was there for those beginning years. And he had two older brothers, John and Paul. Andy was a bit of a sickly child, so he was home a lot. And his mother, to keep him interested and creative, brought him home a lot of movie magazines. So he spent a lot of time seeing movie magazines, and in fact, in 7th grade, when he was home for most of the year, he wrote 25 movie stars for autographs, and the only one that really sent one in was Shirley Temple. So we began to put these pieces together. Now, a second big piece was his mother was very religious. They would go to church. And for any of us who've been lucky to go to a Greek Orthodox church, it's full of all these wonderful chandeliers and the brass and all this stuff, candles all over and so forth. And he talks about sitting in those hard wooden pews for hours at a time looking at the altar. And behind the altar was the wall and were lots of icons of Jesus, of Mother Mary and Joseph and all the rest of the folks. Icon after icon after icon after icon. So you begin to have a sense of the seriality and where that comes from. So now we're putting together the seriality because he loves multiple images. He's infatuated with stardom, fame, Hollywood. Okay? And his mother gets him into art in grade school. In high school, he announces to her that he wants to be an artist. And she says, Andy, it's tough to make a living as an artist. Why don't you become a graphic artist? So he enrolls in what now is Carnegie Mellon University and gets a degree in pictorial design in 1949. He has a good friend in art school, in college there, named Pearlstein, and they make several trips to New York in college. And when he finishes, he makes a beeline for New York and starts making the rounds to a lot of the commercial magazines and so forth to get a job. And there's a fun story when he goes to Glamour magazine and meets with the art director, and he's in these schlumpy khaki pants and tattered shirt and whatever, and he opens up his portfolio to try to convince her that he's a good graphic artist, and out walks a cockroach. And she felt so badly for him, she said, I'll make sure you get some work. So he began to start doing ads for Glamour magazine, other magazines, Bloomingdale's Windows, and as Rick said earlier, he started becoming quite successful economically, and he did ads on washing machines and all these commercial products. Now, let's go back again to that theme, chroniclers of our time. And let's talk about now, we're talking the early 50s. And if we think about the biggest change in society post-World War II, to spoon feed it instead of asking you for more interaction, is really the advent of TV, in my opinion. In other words, movies started in the earlier part of the century, and my dad talked about with his brothers and sisters, they'd go down to downtown Portland for a nickel, they'd see a movie that was being shown at 2,300 screens across the country. So yes, a director could show the same image nationally, but nothing like the impact of TV that started going into homes in the early 50s. And suddenly you had the advertising age. Madison Avenue began, all those advertising firms. And everyone was convincing you to drive a Chevrolet Impala, to wear use Clairol hair products and smoke Marlboros. So the biggest single fact post-World War II was the advent of consumerism and materialism. And therefore, that's what the pop artists, popular culture, are all talking about. That's their theme. That's what they're throwing back at us, is how does the individual maintain their sense of self, their sense of identity, when you're being bombarded and manipulated by others to get you to modify your behavior to buy stuff. I said the other day, I sure wish Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein and others were here today, because with the smartphone, it makes what they were doing look like, prehistoric times. So the work that Andy did, as you see from this exhibition, he started doing shoes and images of things he was doing commercially. And that's why those beautiful fresh images are rarely shown, but they're really quite important. And he did some with his mother, Julia. In 1952, she picked up and moved in with him, moved from Pittsburgh to New York. And she only went back a year and a half before she died to live with her two other sons before she died. And interestingly enough, he never went to her funeral. Another story. Anyway, so he wants to be a fine artist, even though he's making a lot of money being a graphic artist. And he talks about some shows. No one really has his work. Finally, his big break came in 1962 with a show in Los Angeles, a gallery, the Ferris Gallery, run by Irving Blum. And Irving Blum took a chance and brought in a bunch of pop artists for shows. And the first exhibition was the soup can paintings. They were $100 a piece. He sold 2 of them, then realized they should all stay together. He had to call his best clients and say, sorry, I'm not going to let you buy them. He kept them all, and probably 10, 15 years ago, sold half of them to the Modern Museum for $10 million. Now they're probably worth $100 million, and he's gifting the other half. So let's now go to one of his earlier works that's in the show, the S&H green stamps. And let's talk about it a little bit, the soup cans, and then we'll turn over to Rick to talk about the sunsets and endangered species, or one of the others. So when Rick started talking about how political Andy Warhol is, and the reason why I love his work is, for me, all of his work is pregnant with themes. Now, what I see in these works is unique to me, because each of us is made up of 1 million experiences in our lives, and each of us come pre-programmed to any art, and therefore we see it through our eyes and our filters of all that we've been. Now let's talk about S&H green stamps. And my cousin Laura right here probably doesn't remember, but Aunt Lois does, that when I was little, you'd get these S&H green stamps and you'd have to lick them and put them in these little books, right? So to help incentivize people to buy things, these S&H green stamp folks came up with this idea of, hey, Safeway, hey, Chevrolet, hey, clothing store, buy these little stamps from us for peanuts and give them to people. When you spend $1, you get a certain number of S&H green stamps. Now, you'd get these S&H green stamps, you'd go home, and you put them in these little books. You'd lick the pages. And then when you got enough books done, you would take them to the S&H Redemption Center to redeem them for a toaster or a mixer or something. Now, why? Why S&H green stamps? Well, 2 messages. First, Andy Warhol was a huge proponent for the democratization of art. It's a word that will go down forever with him. Mm-hmm. He rebelled against the fact that art was just for some elitist few in museums. Now remember, the graphic artist that he was, he loved making artistic representations of commercial products. So he was trying to say art is all around us. We'll talk about the soup cans in a second, but the S&H green stamps are a beautifully designed, graphic image. But then let's talk about, like Professor Griffith with Faulkner's novel, let's talk about the themes. So here you have a product solely created post-World War II to incentivize the public to buy stuff. You'd get the stamps, put them in a book, and go to the Redemption Center. Now, in the meantime, if we track what was happening to churches and synagogue attendants and others, we began to see post-World War II that sort of going downhill, while materialism and consumerism is going uphill. So is maybe what he's saying, S&H green stamps really become the prayer book of post-World War II America. It's our prayer book of where our values are, that our spiritual values are being changed now to be material values. And even better, you take those S&H green stamp books to the Redemption Center to get redemption, to get redeemed. Go to the soup cans for a second.
I'm sorry?
The soup cans, can you hit the soup cans?
I can get you a soup can.
It's next, isn't it?
I can't go forward.
Oh, you can't?
That's the 2nd October surprise.
Oh, we can't go back and forth on this thing, or what?
I'd have to jump over the surprise.
Oh, another surprise. Oh, well then let's talk about soup cans for a second, because you've all seen them. And let's talk about that real quickly in terms of how I see the soup cans, because I tend to, what I'm trying to get across to you is, what I tend to see in Andy Warhol's work is probably the most themed work of any of those pop artists. So with the soup cans, first, he loved tomato soup. And in grade school and high school, he'd have tomato soup virtually every day. Second of all, back to being the graphic artist and art being all around us. Okay? He's trying to show us, hey, appreciate the beauty of the art in the grocery store all around us. But then let's talk thematically. Why did he pick soup? Well, he's talking about food. Now, Andy Warhol is famous for iconic images, meaning an image that really presents the whole topic of a theme of thought. Okay? Now, if we do a little bit of research and we think about food, okay, now he could have picked rice, he could have picked wheat, he could have picked beef, but in Antarctica, do they have rice or wheat? No. Do they have beef? No. The long and short is, soup is the most universal food product there is. Every society, every geographic region, everywhere in the world, people have soup. So he picked the food product that was the most universal food product. Second of all, okay, when Mr. Campbell came up in 1899 with the idea of creating a canned soup, all his business buddies said, "You are crazy. No one's going to buy soup. Everybody makes soup." Okay, but he forged ahead. Now, if we ask the question as to, from time immemorial, who would make soup, what's the answer, audience? Moms, grandmothers, aunts, whatever. You have the hunter-gatherers out there, they bring them whatever back, okay. So for the first time, a woman didn't have to spend that 4 or 5 hours getting the chicken, getting the carrots, getting the celery, getting all the stuff, making the broth, cooking all the stuff. She could go out into the workforce, into society, and come back, open up a can of soup, and feed her family. So my interpretation of the soup can, and Andy whispered to me that I'm right, no, is that the soup is really, the whole soup can is the beginning of the whole feminist revolution. The beginning of the whole feminist of women moving outside of the house. A giant, giant theme. So I guess what I would suggest is when you see Andy Warhol's work, he just didn't pick these themes out of the air. They're all very thoughtful and huge layers of interpretation. Those are some of mine. Everyone else comes up with theirs, but it's intriguing. Why don't we go to either your surprise or go to the
Well,
sunset?
let me respond to what you said, because I think it's very important. I wouldn't call it a lesson from the exhibition, but it might be a realization, particularly if we're playing off of the stereotypical Warhol, that he's detached, cool, apart from everything, no emotion, I'm a machine. A soup can is a soup can is a soup can, when in fact, and I think that's why this exhibition, one of many reasons why it's a revelation, is that you see so many sides to Warhol. I mean, introspective, brooding, vulnerable, shy, and also in the art. I mean, that would be layered then. That would be, the private self, the public persona. That's two very different sides to the person. The works of art, too, have that kind of ambiguity and multi-layers of meaning, which I think, Jordan, you're speaking to really quite wonderfully. And particularly in terms of and we've talked about this too, when any of us read what someone thinks something is in terms of meaning and interpretation, I've always had 3 litmus tests, and you meet them all with flying colors. Is it plausible? Does it stick to the facts? And is it convincing? And boy, if you get 3 cherries, bing, 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 you have something that you can consider, I think, very, very, very seriously. And I'll give you an example. You have green stamps, I got sunsets, okay? I'm gonna have to, I never thought I'd have to pass over Monroe, but I'm gonna have to do this. If you'd like me to hit the sunset running.
Do.
Okay. How can you do it? There we go. Yeah. I mean, maybe the Oz, my response too. Beautiful design, beautiful color, this peaceful, tranquil, one of the most photographed, the sunset. Warhol at this time was using his own photography. He wasn't appropriating photography in most cases. This wasn't the case for the endangered species, but here he's using a photograph, which is actually a still frame from a short film that he did for the Rothko Chapel. It was commissioned, a sunset. That fell through, but he used this as a basis for a commission that Philip Johnson gave him in the early 1970s to provide prints for hotel rooms in a new luxury hotel in Minneapolis, the Marquette. And indeed, he did just that. In this case, the screen-printed sunset was colored in different ways, which usually makes up, let's say, for example, this might be a portfolio of 8 screen prints where color is varied in this serial rethinking of the image. But in this case, the 642 screen prints that he did produce, each was unique. It's almost a kind of contradiction. A print is a multiple, it's one thing over and over again. Here was 642 different prints. Well, the prints did go up, but at a certain point, these prints came back to Warhol, and then he additioned them into portfolios of six unique prints. One of the sets is upstairs, is here in the exhibition. Well, you can imagine that image here might be passed over as his interior decoration for a hotel. Warhol is going, this is Warhol light. Right? It's his graphic design, and after all, it's above beds. In fact, it's quite possible that a number of these were abutted on a wall to create a kind of sunset wallpaper. So this is not the stuff of great art. This is the stuff of inspired graphic decoration.
So stop there a second. So I've always assumed with these sunsets that he was paying homage to the abstract expressionists, because we've seen most artists. Look at Roy Lichtenstein. He did the Haystacks. He did the Ruined Cathedral, paying homage to Matisse. And I love these. I never paid much attention to them, put 2 up in my last house and thought, these are beautiful. And as the sun filters in, it dances with the colors. How wonderful that he was paying homage to, the Rothko it looks like those color fields and whatever. And I was happy as a clam with that explanation until...
Sure. But I agree. I mean, we're talking about layered nuance. I mean, right, I mean, one could say Gottlieb and Rothko in one breath, and Warhol, that it's a sort of riff, a kind of ironic riff on Rothko or Gottlieb, and it has a kind of archetypal quality to it, and very beautiful, yes. But then let's peel the onion. And I began peeling it when I thought, Warhol often is not, a Warhol work of art is not what you think it is, or it's not as simple as just that. There may be other dimensions to it, and this image kept bothering me because it reminded me of something. I thought, no, it couldn't be. That'd be so absurd. If in fact there was a connection to the hydrogen bomb. No, that can't be the case. Can't be the case at all. And then I thought, well, let's see. Let's go back through the database. In 1965, Warhol did a painting called Atomic Bomb, which you see on the screen. And he, very Warholian, a photographic image repeated over and over and over and over again. It's an atomic bomb blast in the southwest of the United States, in the desert. And then when you look at it more closely, you'll notice that as you move through these 32, 37 repeated images, they're not all the same. Well, it's red and black. Look more closely. As you read, which we do in the West, left to right, and then down, top to bottom, the image gets more and more overexposed until in the very last register, the last frame is black or nothingness. I recall this actually from college when the instructor, the professor talking about this, asked the class, well, you got one atomic bomb. What do you have when you have 37? Nuclear holocaust. It's all, I mean, you see what I mean? This is not distant fey, this kind of wry sophistication. It's politicized, and it is absolutely, extremely powerful. But still, okay, so I thought, well, okay, let's work with this, okay? I thought, well, I started looking into what I vaguely recalled, maybe some of you did too, who were here and about in the 50s after the war, in the early 60s, that the government began publishing photographs of hydrogen bomb detonations in the South Pacific in magazines, Life magazine, and they were, and also film too, these. The tests I had forgotten were each given names. Each test had a name. So lo and behold, I find a test near the Christmas Islands in the South Pacific that was called Sunset. And then I started going through some of the popular media, and then I came across, this was the broad smile moment, although it's so horrendous, the subject, when I thought, that's what I was somehow, in the back of my mind, I was thinking about.
There you go.
Okay. I was, as a student of mine would say, showboating with this. Woo, wow. Maybe it could be, but what's more important is that, I love this too, the question, well, so what? It can be both, or it can be, but is there any kind of connection here between the two? Now, this is speculative, okay? So bring out your litmus test of, sticks to the facts, convincing, it's plausible. Is that I think Warhol, in one of his most ironic moments, is bringing together two realities: a luxury hotel, privilege and complacency. It can be positive or negative, but nonetheless, a luxury hotel, money, and then to somehow be subversive with what effectively is sofa art, to make some commentary on the culture that creates this wonderful hotel is also a culture that is not disentangled from greater realities which are almost diametrically opposed. And so I offer this, and I think it's one reason why we thought, well, I mean, I just was smiling. I thought, when the decision was made to put Sunset on the cover. Not to affirm and legitimate my read, which is personal, but to present Warhol, another side of Warhol. And I think this may suggest what we both so much love about Warhol is his complexity and his humanity and his compassion.
And I think it was brilliant because of the hundreds of Warhol books. No one has ever come up on this theme. And with the way I read all of Warhol's work, this is brilliant. And if you think about the Camouflage series, if you think about the Electric Chair series, I mean, this was a man back again to chroniclers of our time. Look at those images of the electric chairs that the Rosenbergs were executed in. He takes that horrific image, but he does it with these beautiful fading colors. Because remember, an artist has to get us to stop and look at their work. He seduces us with these beautiful colors and familial images until we look at the work and then we're shaken up. The Camouflage series, what a brilliant series. Camouflage, what's it used for? For war. And then he does all these gorgeous colors. Is he making a statement about the Vietnam War? Is he also making a personal statement about his public persona versus the sort of hidden Andy Warhol and how he camouflages himself in the public versus what's inside? There's the reason why I think this is such a brilliant artist, and I think the most important artist of the last half of the 20th century, is because these themes are as fresh today as they were when he did the work. And and Rick said something fabulous yesterday or day before, because when I talk about Ellsworth Kelly or Lichtenstein or Frank Stella or these other guys, I always say these are the most important artists of the last 50 years. And I guess in essence, explain this last thing and we'll finish with that and one last little thing. Because I think you laid it out brilliantly, because we were blessed, I think. Sometimes art and culture goes through these patterns where there are more geniuses than others. And I think that post-World War II period was a time when, especially in visual art, there were just brilliant people. So explain what you said about the relevance of the Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns and Lichtenstein and Frank Stella and Ellsworth Kelly and Warhol and probably Jim Dine, and what you said that helped add clarity to me about Warhol and his place and time.
Well, I think, we were laughing about what we were talking about earlier, like, oh, he's the greatest, she's the greatest, he's the greatest, yeah? And we were thinking, one argument for Warhol being among the greatest, or perhaps you might want to elevate him, peace to Kelly and Johns and Rauschenberg, is how accessible the art is at this point in time. That is, with abstraction, you are making certain demands upon an audience in terms of their experience with abstraction. But Warhol, his imagery is photographic, and in 2016, that image, photographic, electronic, and digital, is the pervasive visual language of our time. So everybody has access to that, from Instagram, to a fine art photograph, digital photography has access to that. And I taught a history of photography show. Yeah, boy, mixing my careers here. A history of photography course, and also I did modern and contemporary, and I always had to confront, which is a challenge. You really, after a few years teaching modern and contemporary, you start having answers to questions, right? What's it supposed to be? Oh, my kid's sister could do it. Or like, what are you talking about? I mean, it was fun because you saw conversion experiences, some, confirmed in their beliefs. Photography, of course, was so wonderful. Nobody ever once said to me, Ansel Adams, my kid's sister could do that. Because everybody was with me. It was so great to have all these students. They just absolutely loved it. So to come back to photography as a democratic language, to Warhol's notion of democratic art, which is why I think Warhol may be on another level for his extraordinarily broad appeal and his topicality, which we both agree. You know, he was an artist of his time. He's an artist of our time.
So we agreed that all those half dozen folks, they're equally good. But the reason why Warhol rises above them is because of the ability of the audience to engage with his work. And he is the easiest of all those masters to engage with. So lastly, I just want to thank again the Portland Art Museum. When Brian Rario came over about a year and a half ago and talked about doing a major exhibition and came up with the idea of the Warhol one, I said, you know, really blow it out. Take over the whole museum. Help make an experience of going back in time like you're going back to the factory or back to Studio 54. And I think Brian, Sarah, the whole team did a brilliant, brilliant job. Obviously, we've been connected to the museum for a long time, and I think we have, as all of you have, been blessed with some amazing exhibitions. And whether I'm biased or not, I think this is absolutely the best thing the museum's ever done in terms of how they, other than my mother and late father's show of a couple years ago, but in terms of how they've used the space, opened up the galleries, and made it easier for all of us who may have already liked Warhol a bit, but to really walk into this genius's mind. And the final plea is for all of you, I've said, is, you know, too many eyes don't wear out the art. So the only shame is the museum's done a fabulous job with these 20,000 school kid tours, but for every one of your kids, grandkids, neighbor kids, aunts, uncles, whoever it is, beg of you, please get them to the show. And then the last thing is, because I'll get too emotional, the book's fabulous. Read the last paragraph for a second.
The last paragraph?
Last paragraph.
This is the last paragraph of Jordan's
The collector's statement.
Acknowledgements. Finally, my mother, Arlene, has been widely recognized for being instrumental in helping so many in Portland and the Pacific Northwest recognize the importance of owning and living with art. It is with deep appreciation, respect, and love that I thank my mother, who not only gave me life, but also gave me the passion for art that enriches my life. And to her, I dedicate this book and all that I do in the art world.